Okay, so let's take a look at this Brené Brown statement on Gaza, shall we? Um, I'll just say I'm not a huge Brené Brown fan. I'm not that familiar with her work. I'm also not a Brené Brown hater. I personally don't go for the, shut up white woman um, approach to pushing back on people like this. I think there's a lot of sort of latent misogyny that gets snuck in Trojan horse style into this white woman business. And of course, people of color are entitled to point out how people's privilege blinds them to the ways of the world, and has white womanhood been weaponized inside supremacist systems to launder or obscure vicious violence of all kinds, of course. But I would say white manhood is by far much more directly responsible for those things. So I don't quite get what's being expressed when we accuse someone of being an out of touch white woman, except a kind of latent misogyny, or women having to go the extra mile to call out their own, which itself is a facet of patriarchy. So that's not at all the tack I'm going to take. I'm just treating her like a human being with a huge platform who's made a shit ton of money teaching people how to be vulnerable. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's all good. I would be a hypocrite if I called her out for being a self-help guru, because I co-wrote a book that is doing well and probably sits on a lot of self-help shelves. Uh, I would just say that her work seems to be geared towards helping people cope with intolerable, unhealthy systems like the corporate world, and to be a little bit more authentic in it. And her work is also amenable to, I'm not saying she deliberately makes it this way, but certainly corporations would have no trouble incorporating vulnerability training and things like that into their modus operandi, their way of already doing things. So it doesn't exactly subvert the system. And I think we're going to see that in this statement, that is just true. And so she's a quintessential example of the self-help influencer whose worldview is very much bounded inside certain boundaries, and they define the terms of thought and, in the political context, of debate. And in some ways, that's as dangerous or more dangerous than the more overtly bigoted people, the more overtly sectarian people like Mayim Bialik or Amy Schumer or whoever else in the celebrity world, because this sounds very reasonable and peace-loving and even human and spiritual, but it's got all kinds of insidious assumptions to it that if people swallow them hook, line, and sinker, could really limit them from seeing some important truths that would truly be required to see all people in this conflict as human and to be a morally responsible human being. So let's take a look. I continue to be overwhelmed by the violence, trauma, and sheer magnitude of the Israel-Hamas war. While a lot of people are rightly pointing out that it's not really a war, it's a one-sided massacre and slaughter, a Holocaust, small h, and a genocide and all those other things. But I'm going to let her pass on that one, because I've even seen some Palestine activists slip into using the word war. So, let's not get all tied up over one word in the first sentence. There's plenty of else in here to get tied up about. Listen to this. I'm deeply connected to the Jewish community, and I want the people I love and care about to know that I see their fear and hurt and that I support them. That's one sentence. The next sentence. As a fierce supporter of human dignity, I want the Palestinian people who are also in pain and fear and who continue to struggle for basic freedoms and self-determination to know that I support them. Well, her ordering of things is going to be a theme throughout here. It always starts with the Jews and the Israelis, and she points out that those are the people to whom she is deeply connected, right? So she's deeply personally connected to the Jewish community, and she wants the people she loves and cares about personally to know that she empathizes and supports them. And then she remembers, oh, okay, but I'm also a fierce supporter of human dignity, so I want the Palestinian people who are also in pain and fear. Okay, well, it's an odd ordering of things. It's an odd place to use that word also. That also is doing a lot of work for you here, Brené, because if you actually look at all the measures of proportionality or proportion in this war, you have hundreds of times more Palestinians killed than Israelis, many hundreds, maybe even thousands of times more Palestinians maimed and wounded, an infinite magnitude more property destruction. In fact, an entire society flattened. Okay, you have way more Palestinians all over the world. I believe the Palestinian diaspora is quite a bit bigger than the number of Zionist Jews in the world, and they are being every day, not indirectly, what's the word, kind of secondhand traumatized. There's a technical term for it, I forget. Trauma by proxy, watching their friends, family members, and land be decimated by the fourth largest military in the world, aided by the first largest military in the world, with no support coming from anywhere except some countries in the global south doing God's actual work, calling it out. So there's no also here. Also, the violence done to Israelis, which is to say Israeli citizens, because once Israel invades, their soldiers are fair game, and I would say their soldiers were fair game even on October 7th, given that they are the occupying power. But even if we say that, we're going to include all the Israelis, well, the vast majority of the violence to Israelis was done on one single morning or afternoon in October. And since then, every single damn day, Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank have been under a constant 24-hour, unremitting reign of terror. So in this very first paragraph, for you to somehow equate the pain and fear of Jewish people, right? The Jewish community. You're not even talking about Israelis. You're talking about the Jewish community, where mostly probably in America. That's where most of the Jews live. So you're equating their pain and fear, their emotional distress, their concerns about rising anti-Semitism, their sympathy for Israel, and their memory of what happened 4 months ago, and their concern for the 130 hostages, whatever it is. You're equating that to the daily terror and murder and slaughter and maiming of Palestinian men, women, children, and babies, and the reducing to rubble of an entire densely populated strip of land. And then you have the gall to sort of add that as a tagline to the first point. So it's first, you're connected to the Jewish community, and then you also recognize that Palestinians are suffering. And you also might want to ask yourself, why is it that you're deeply connected to the Jewish community, but you somehow also have to kind of remember that there are Palestinians in the world? That already is a function of a kind of system where there's a lot fewer Jews in America than there are Arab Americans, but somehow the community to which you feel an allegiance and a deep connection are the Jews. So just that's something to consider. Below are my beliefs and thoughts on the Israel-Hamas war. We've already said that. They don't fit on an Instagram square, and many of you may find them naive or conflicting or not enough. Naive, sure. I find them disingenuous. Conflicting, maybe you mean contradictory. Yes. Not enough, absolutely. That's okay. So she's granting us the right to disagree. Okay, so I'm going to disagree vocally and in detail. These ideas are based on my experiences, my faith, and my values. Yes, they are based on your experiences, and you might want to consider that your experiences are very limited, and they're limited in a certain direction, just like most mainstream Americans who benefit from the system. You're not exposed, not just your experiences, but your learning. And I would say, Brené, with all of your resources, you have no excuse, because you could look into this. You could look at, and if you just want to stay connected to the Jewish community, you could look at Jewish and Israeli sources. From the Zionist Benny Morris to the non-Zionist Ilan Pape. If you wanted to know the history of this conflict and take it outside of the realm of your faith and your values and your feelings, you actually could. So it suggests to me that you don't want to. You, Brené Brown, are not lacking for time during the day to do a little bit of research. You have the resources to say, okay, I'm going to take a day or two before I speak on this and educate myself about some of the history. So I'm glad that you um, acknowledge that Palestinians are fighting for self-determination, but it's much more than that. They're fighting for their very existence and their very lives in a way that makes Israel's struggle for existence and safety look pretty minor by comparison. And I'm not trying to minimize the subjective experience of Israelis and Jews right now, but subjective experiences are just subjective experiences. And then there's material reality. And please don't conflate supporting nonviolence with neutrality. I'm not sure what that means. It often takes more courage to wage peace than to wage war. That's why it's so rare. Okay, so we already see where this is going. This is reminding me a lot of the Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat bromance era of Oslo, which led absolutely nowhere and in fact instilled, or rather reinforced, a regime of violence. And its neutrality and its nonviolent veneer of peacemaking, as Edward Said said, it wasn't a peace process, it was all process, no peace. But this was exactly the rhetoric, Yitzhak Rabin, the former terrorist, saying, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. Bill Clinton, Shalom Chaver, all that business, right? So this kind of language sounds good, but let's look under the surface and see what the material reality is and what you're actually supporting. I see God easily and fully in the faces of Israelis and Palestinians, in Jewish faces and Muslim faces. Don't forget the Christian faces of the Palestinians who are being bombed. Israeli bombs don't know the difference between Muslim and Christian, but that's fine. You see God in their faces? Great. I support a peaceful, prosperous, secure, and free Israel. I support a peaceful, prosperous, secure, and free Palestine. All right. I'm not going to get into a whole re-education rant about the contradictions between that. Maybe a two-state solution is actually possible. Let's just go with the assumption that perhaps it is. I'm unpersuaded of that at the moment, but that's not important. I believe the greatest threat to peace and prosperity for both Israel and Palestine is extremism and terrorism. Okay, now we're getting into some real comfy liberal pajamas that feel really nice, but they don't mean anything. Or worse, they mean something quite nefarious, because you, Brené, like most Westerners, have a particular vision of what extremism and terrorism mean. Now, I'm sure extremism probably includes, in your mind, extremists like Ben Gvir and Smotrich and maybe even Netanyahu. What you don't see is that entire picture that all of Israeli society has become radically extremist. It's moved so far to the right that Netanyahu is actually kind of a moderate. And as far as terrorism goes, this is one of these words that, has a definition. And if we were to apply the definition, we would see that Western states are the biggest terrorists in the world. You're living in one. It's called the United States. Israel is right up there. Terrorism is the use of violence to try to, against civilians, by the way, to try and achieve a political outcome. And that is explicitly Israel's policy. And they have vastly more resources to exact that terrorist terror upon a civilian population. Not only a civilian population, a captive civilian population with no right to movement, who can't leave, who can't flee. The scale of the terrorism that Israel and Zionism have unleashed on Palestinians is just orders of magnitude beyond imagining greater than anything that the worst Palestinian resistance groups or terrorist groups could dream of doing with to Israelis, or ever have done to Israelis with their limited resources. Now, I am not minimizing the horror of a bus bombing or the horror of a suicide attack, or even the terror of having rockets shot at you, even if the vast majority of those rockets are either intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome, or they land in fields, or they do relatively little damage. Nothing compared to the 2,000-pound bombs that your government and the government of the country that I live in is sending free of charge to Israel while pretending to care about Palestinian life. So that's the terrorism. And if you cared about extremism and terrorism. And if you thought that was the greatest threat to peace and prosperity for both Israel and Palestine, you'd ask which side has the power to and is actually inflicting more extremism and terrorism, and how much more. And if you saw that, you would not be able to continue writing all the other shit that you write in this post, because it would just become moot. You would start raising your voice primarily and maybe even only against the side that your government is supporting, because that's what you as a citizen and an influential citizen in a democratic society have the power and leverage to do. Let's continue. Terrorism, which by definition targets civilians and is perpetrated to instill terror and trauma in groups of people, is never acceptable, not even when perpetrated by members of groups who have been marginalized. Wow. Okay. Well, first of all, under international law, marginalized. Okay, that's a really funny use of the word marginalized. You know who's marginalized? Queer people in the United States or all over the world. They're marginalized. There are all kinds of groups, and I'm not saying they don't face violence, but they're not facing a terror campaign of bombing raining down on them. People of color are marginalized in society, meaning that their rights can be curtailed, their experiences aren't recognized, they're not seen and heard, they don't occupy the same positions of power, they have institutional constraints. These are not minor things. These are important things, and they can even include, First Nations and Native Americans who are marginalized now. But what that started with was not marginalization, it was extermination, all right? That's the legacy, which now takes the form of marginalization and worse. When it comes to the Palestinians, the issue is not their marginalization. You're using this woke social justice language, which is completely anodyne and completely flattens the material reality of having your homeland basically settled, invaded, and then taken out from underneath you. You're forcibly expelled 750,000 Palestinians in 1948, which you might not know, but you could know if you wanted to know. And then you're brutalized and bombed and terrorized and tortured and traumatized. You want to talk about trauma and terror? Some World Health Organization, or maybe the UN, some foundation did a study of which regions, war-torn regions, had the most trauma among children. And this was in 2004, 2005. Before the 20-year medieval, inhuman, illegal blockade of Gaza by Israel. And it found that by far Gaza's children had the most signs of PTSD. How much trauma do you think they're carrying now? Have you seen the videos of these kids with their legs blown off, or shaking from fear, or who can't stop crying, or who can't even speak? Their eyes they tell the tale of horrors that no human being should see, much less a tiny, vulnerable child who's lost their parents, lost their siblings, lost the entire world around them. Do you know that you can't even imagine the level of that terror and trauma? And yet you have the naivete or the disingenuity to start with the implication or the insinuation that where the terror and trauma are mainly living is in Israel, where people are the victims of a marginalized group who is a terrorist group who lives to traumatize and terrorize civilians, as opposed to, say, a resistance group that has used terrorist tactics, that has targeted civilians. Whatever you think of that, resistance groups have the right to resist. That's what I was getting at before. By any means available. That's encoded in international law. You don't have to like it, but it's the truth. Whereas states, especially occupying states, have no rights, much less the right to terrorize and traumatize a captive civilian population. So you're flipping things very conveniently. Where do you go right after that? I believe Hamas is a terrorist organization. Good for you. That's a stunningly brave position to take, Brené. You and every other comfy celebrity and government official and mainstream media personality believes to your soul that Hamas is a terrorist organization. Great. Good for you. And their actions consistently and predictably pose extreme threats to peace in the region. No, they don't pose extreme threats. They expose that there is no peace in the region, and there can't be until the occupation ends, until the powerful party releases its grip on the party with very little, if no power. And I keep saying this, when you are the warden of an illegal prison, which imprisons people for the crime of being themselves and from the nation they're from, you have no right whatsoever to complain about or condemn which prison gang happens to rise up inside that godforsaken jail that you've incarcerated people in for the crime of being who they are, to try and throw off the shackles of the oppressor. And by the way, intifada literally means shaking off. So that's exactly what Hamas is. Never mind the fact that this terrorist organization that you condemn was initially supported by Israel for very, very good reasons, because Israel didn't want to have to negotiate with the secular moderate PLO, which was from the 1970s on indicating that they would be willing to negotiate along international legal lines, i.e. UN Resolution 242, which is the two-state solution. So starting here with, I believe Hamas is a terrorist organization, is a huge confession of your ignorance and your bias. They continue to put the Palestinian people in danger by using civilians as shields. That's bullshit. That's an Israeli propaganda line. It's been debunked over and over again by Amnesty International and other human rights groups. B'Tselem, the Israeli one, if you want to go to the sources of the people you're deeply connected to, go look at this Jewish-run human rights organization, B'Tselem. The human rights accusation is a canard. On the other hand, human rights organizations have found that the IDF, the Israeli army, routinely uses Palestinians as human shields. So, and in some ways, the settlers are human shields too, but they're willing human shields, so let's leave that aside. I believe the sadistic violence perpetrated on October 7th against innocent Israelis and the taking of hostages is unjustifiable and indefensible, and all hostages should be returned. Okay, yeah, in a perfect world, they should be returned. You might ask what the Israeli government is doing to ensure that they be returned, as opposed to what the Israeli government is doing to ensure that they never come back, along the lines of the secret, but not so secret, Hannibal Directive that governs Israeli policy towards their own captives and hostages. But if hostages should be returned, then hostage takers should be negotiated with. That's what returns hostages, Brené. And we can agree that the violence perpetrated on October 7th against those Israelis who were innocent, the civilians in those kibbutzim and towns, is unjustifiable and indefensible. I'll say that. I'm not going to condemn resistance groups, but I will say that action, I can't support it either. But as far as sadism, again, you're taking this line that comes from this assumption that sadism only comes from quote-unquote quote-unquote terrorist groups, which is what you call any resistance group that uses violence to try and shake off their 80 years of oppression and dispossession. The sadism of the Israeli government right now has not been seen since, I don't know, Cambodia, the US and Vietnam, the Nazis. You'd have to reach to some pretty gruesome and infamous and ignominious, is that the word, examples throughout history to find comparable sadism. And across the society, you're seeing absolute sadism. You're seeing Israelis dressing up as Palestinians in a kind of Middle Eastern blackface and doing TikTok videos, making fun of these people's loss of their homes and lack of clean water and food. I can only believe that Hamas knew that their actions would be filmed and shared. The goal had to be to quash any hope of peace and to sow as much hatred and fear as possible. This is extremely short-sighted. I was speaking to a Jewish Israeli the other day who has spent a lot of time in Gaza, and he said unequivocally, he has absolutely no doubt, knowing these people, knowing the kinds of men who would have joined that day, that suicide mission. They knew they weren't going to come back, most of them. Why would they do that? For revenge, not to quash any hope of peace and to sow hatred and fear. The hatred and fear have been sown already, they have sowed, I'm not sure what the verb is there, but they have already been hurled into the world, as Bob Dylan said in Masters of War. You've thrown the worst fear that could ever be hurled, the fear to bring children into this world. Israel has destroyed the past, present, and future of the Gazan people, and more broadly, the Palestinians who are under occupation. So that's the goal of the Israelis, the Israeli government, to quash any hope of peace. They've talked about it already, very publicly. And as far as Hamas knew that their actions would be filmed and shared, yeah, maybe some of them did. I doubt the Hamas leadership was like, go make TikTok videos of your sadism. And we don't know how many of those people acted ad hoc in a frenzy of exultation and kind of ecstasy at being let out of their prison for the very first time in their lives, and took out their anger and desire for revenge against Israeli citizens. But we do know that Israeli soldiers who know exactly what they're doing are filming themselves brutalizing, torturing, and mocking and dehumanizing Palestinians as these soldiers invade and destroy Gazan society, and proudly putting it on TikTok. And you have an entire country that is cheering it or kind of just laughing it away and saying, oh, well, you know, boys will be boys or girls will be girls. I believe that Netanyahu and many other members of his cabinet are authoritarian leaders, good for you, that's true, who support an agenda that is rooted in maintaining power over at all costs. They appear more committed to maintaining their own power than they are committed to finding peace. That's true. They're also more committed to brutalizing and eliminating an entire people than they are to finding peace. So once again, when it comes to Hamas and the Palestinians, you overstate the case. When it comes to Israel, you vastly understate the case. I believe in the evidence that demonstrates that all human atrocities across history start with dehumanization. I believe that anti-Semitism in all forms is dehumanizing. I stand passionately against it, and you say the same thing about Islamophobia and anti-Arab language. Dehumanization is not only language, dehumanization is actions. And speaking of language, your language here completely dehumanizes Palestinians, because human beings deserve to be seen and heard for what's actually happened to them, and to be considered empathetically and compassionately in the light of the context that exists for their actions. Your inability or unwillingness to do that is a dehumanization of those people, and you would never do so. You'd never dream of doing so to the Jewish community to which you're quote-unquote deeply connected, because you see them as human beings. You think you see Palestinians as human beings, but your blind spot is glaring here, Brené. Glaring. I don't believe that all Israelis and Jewish people around the world support the current Israeli government and their policies any more than I believe all Americans support Trump. Oh, Trump, the only U.S. president in the last however many decades not to get the U.S. into a new war. And never mind that Biden, the one that you, I guess, de facto or by default support, is the one sending the 2,000-pound bombs, brutalizing and eliminating and assaulting and genociding the people you claim to see God's face in their faces. You also don't believe that Palestinians and Muslims around the world support Hamas, or all Palestinians and Muslims around the world support Hamas. Okay, well, good for them. So you're giving them a little pat on the back for not supporting Hamas. But you know what? Most Palestinians and Arabs around the world, and Muslims and Christians who you keep forgetting about for some reason, maybe because you share faith with them, I'm assuming you're a Christian, and it might be a little inconvenient for you to recognize that your own fellow soldiers in Christ are being slaughtered indiscriminately. You don't believe they support Hamas, but you know what they do support? They support the right of the Palestinians to resist by all available means. And if Hamas is the only game in town in Gaza, as Israel's made sure is the case, then they may not support it or cheer it on, but something in them says, I'm not going to condemn that, okay? And again, your inability to see why that might be is you dehumanizing Palestinians from the jump. And then you talk about you moderating a panel at the Nobel Women's Initiative Conference, a nice big fancy conference. I'm sure these things are very lovely and inspiring, and there's a lot of nice talk. And you met Israeli and Palestinian families. You you met people who are working for a nonviolent movement. So you met Ali Abu Awad and his work to build a national nonviolent movement, the Tagir movement. Okay, do you know what happens to Palestinians when they protest nonviolently? Check out the Great March of Return in 2018, or was it 2019, where Israeli snipers had a contest to see how many Palestinian knees they could take out, maim. And these were the knees of people who were doing what? Marching, walking towards a occupation fence, an apartheid wall that was keeping them from their ancestral homelands, keeping them immured, walled in a ghetto, concentration camp, open air prison, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so your love of nonviolence reeks of the kind of white liberalism that not just Malcolm X, but the person I'm sure you hold as even more of a hero, Martin Luther King, railed against in his letter from a Birmingham jail. And he called people like you even more dangerous than the overt racists, because you like the nonviolent thing, but you're not willing to have a backbone and support the right of resistance. And you don't get that riots are the language of the unheard. If riots are the language of the unheard, as King said, then October 7th is the language of the brutalized. So you're just being inconsistent in your reasoning, again, along the lines of who you consider to be fully human, not ideologically, not consciously, but in who you're being. You see one group as more human than the other because you're willing to listen to their narrative and understand the context on a much deeper, more emotional, and shall we say vulnerable level. The families living in anguish deserve so much better from us. You're valorizing these grieving family members and survivors who choose peace. Yeah, including the families of the hostages and some of the former hostages who are saying what Israel's doing in Gaza is creating more October 7th. Stop it. You choose to support them and their mission. Great. But you're supporting the ones that make you feel comfortable, Brené. I'm going to accuse you of that. You like feeling like you're on the right side, and you like feeling like your side doesn't have anything to atone or account for, right? And you like feeling like you're not supporting a genocide. So these peaceful families, which I have no problem with, and I'm sure I would be inspired by, you're using them as cover for your cowardice. In addition to not having any easy answers, there are issues I'm still trying to understand. So let me give you some easy answers that I've swallowed from the mainstream media. In other words, this is the same thing. It's like it's so complicated, but let's simplify it down to a kindergarten level. It seems to me that there are several governments in the Middle East that are significantly influencing the geopolitics of that region. And benefiting from the brutal violence in Gaza. Who, for instance? Could it be the United States, which has military bases across the Middle East, even though they don't live there? No, especially Iran. Again, not to be confused with the incredible people of Iran. Despite trying to read and listen, I don't fully understand the complexity of the issues. That's an understatement. I'll keep learning. Well, I hope you'll keep learning from somewhere other than the U.S. security state, the CIA, and their mouthpieces and stenographers in the mainstream media. I truly do, because you're not going to learn anything new from them. You're just going to double down on this bullshit. Okay, so there are several governments, let's say in the world, that are significantly influencing the geopolitics of that region. Why don't you start with your own, which has by far the biggest influence on the geopolitics of every region, especially this one. Billions of dollars a year to Israel, and these days also to Egypt, right? Significantly influencing the geopolitics of that region. Your concern about Iran is so paper thin. It's got no substance to it whatsoever. Be concerned about the government you pay taxes to, Brené. That's the responsible obligation of any citizen in a democratic society. We voted them in. We got to hold them accountable. We got to take responsibility for what our governments are doing before we take the easy route and sort of fret, speculatively and a little bit in a concerned way about the governments of Iran and other places in the Middle East that are understandably threatened by the imperial regimes that our governments represent and perpetuate. I believe in free speech. I believe that free speech has reasonable limits. For instance, yelling fire in a crowded theater. I believe in peaceful protest. What I don't understand is where exactly to draw the line. Okay, then you don't believe in free speech, because the yelling fire in a crowded theater is a very specific, cliched exception to the rule, okay? Under free speech laws, hate speech is allowed unless it's directly inciting imminent violence. And if you want to learn about this, go watch Glenn Greenwald on Rumble. His System Update show has really explained this point very, very well. And Chomsky said it, Noam Chomsky, who you might want to go read. Brené, I'm not sure if you've ever read him. He's a little bit outside the mainstream. He made this point a long time ago. If you only believe in free speech for views you agree with, or in tones of voice or rhetorical styles that you feel comfortable with, you don't believe in free speech. You're a liberal authoritarian. If language is a tool of dehumanization and violence, language is not a tool of violence except when those in power use it to launder their crimes that are being committed in the material world, not the emotional world, which you seem so comfortable in. When do we intervene? I don't believe Jewish students should feel afraid to go to class or walk through campus. I don't think anyone has the right not to feel afraid. Feelings are not subject to rights. And it's a kind of liberal fascism that sentimentalizes people's feelings and says that people have the right not to feel certain ways. No, you don't. The world is a scary place. It's full of people who disagree with you. And especially if you're supporting a regime that's brutalizing their people, they have the absolute goddamn right to make you feel uncomfortable. And if you feel afraid walking through campus, not because there's gun-toting Palestinians on Harvard Commons or Columbia, your Ivy League school, but because they're wearing keffiyehs and shouting intifada and from the river to the sea, that's your problem. You're triggered. The trigger is the smallest part of the gun. Deal with your own payload. What are you carrying? What guilty conscience? What fear? What ignorance? What bigotry? That's where your fear is coming from. All right? I don't believe Muslim students should be subjected to demeaning remarks or other forms of violence. Well, I don't think they should be subjected to demeaning remarks, but demeaning remarks are not the same as violence. However, other forms of violence, like getting shot point blank in Vermont for wearing keffiyehs and speaking Arabic, yeah, there's laws against that. So free speech is a matter of law. And in the United States, at least, where the founding fathers drew the line is, if it ain't violence, if it's speech, it's allowed and it's protected, and F your feelings. When is language violence? I've already said language is a tool of violence when it's connected to power structures that are committing actual violence, and the language is used to keep people in the dark about it, or to keep people cheering it, or to keep people denying it, or minimizing it, or justifying it. How do campus Jesus Christ, as if campus safety is the biggest issue right now. You've bought in whole hog to the mainstream narrative here. I've been thinking a lot about why so many people consider any position on this war that centers all humanity. You do not center all humanity. You're lying to yourself, probably. You do not. You center Jewish humanity, and you put off to the side the material conditions which inform the humanity and affect the humanity and threaten the humanity and sometimes snuff out the humanity of Palestinians and Arabs. Why people consider any position on this war that centers all humanity as sacred as a weak position or a cop-out? Well, why don't you ask yourself, why do people consider all lives matter a weak position or a cop-out, or worse, a threatening position, a nefarious position? There's a reason for that. Now, you can make the argument that all lives matter is a fair statement to make, but we can also understand why people don't trust it, to say the least. So you're just not thinking with your full brain here. What do we think when we know somebody, okay, blah, 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 and then people are calling you out from pathetic to a huge disappointment and a fascist? I don't need to use words like that. You're just fucking up. You're wrong. You're parroting unexamined assumptions sold to you by a corporate media and a power structure that you benefit from and that you're not inclined to subvert. That's all. I could say it's cowardly, I could say it's ignorant, whatever. But it sucks. It's not aligned with who you say you are. It has no integrity, and it's not worthy of our respect. We don't have to call you names to say that. Your mother died in December. Okay, you can justify not speaking out about it. You've had a difficult 10 weeks. Fine. I'm not calling you out for not speaking out. I'm pretty used to spiritual healers and teachers not speaking out. That's kind of their jam these days. But when you do speak out and you come out with this shit, welcome to the fray. Welcome to the ring. Welcome to criticism and accountability. So you don't get to, on the one hand, pull, I've been having a hard time, my mother died. My condolences to you and your family, truly. But then I'll turn around and say, here I am saying this, and if anyone criticizes me and calls me anything, again, it's just more unfairness, and it's more, it's more not wanting peace. It's totally disingenuous, sanctimonious, and, it's the use of privilege in the worst way. How primal is the urge to avoid pain and that terrible feeling of not knowing? Who are you talking about here? I think you have a primal urge to avoid pain, yours and other people's, and that terrible feeling of not knowing. For the guru of vulnerability, that's quite a blind spot, because there would be a serious vulnerability in you opening yourself fully to the reality of the situation. As an American, as a person, as a woman, as I think a mother, I don't know if you're a mother, but if you are, as Norman Finkelstein asked Candace Owens, how would you feel if what's happening to Palestine's children every single day was happening to yours? Has ideology become a pretend safe haven that actually protects us from experiencing the agony of others or offering compassion? Oh, you don't think you have an ideology, do you? You're just neutral. Your ideology is seeing the light of God in every human face. Your ideology is nonviolence. No, 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 no. Your ideology is the blank neutralization of a very non-neutral reality. That's your religion, and you're a fucking fundamentalist based on this video, okay? So all these people, starting with Sam Harris all the way to you, Brené Brown, who like to sort of put themselves in a position of, I just wish everyone was neutral like me. You ain't neutral. You can't be neutral in a moving train, as Howard Zinn said. You might want to go read him as well. When we understand the brutality of 10/7, of October 7th, why do we look away? Who's looking away? Who's we? It's being shoved in our faces every single day by the mainstream media. Who are you talking about when we understand do you understand the brutality of every day since October 7th? I don't think you do. When we see the death and desperation of innocent Palestinian people, I'm sure you have a certain category called non-innocent Palestinian people, what do we have to tell ourselves to be okay with that? Everything you're saying is what we have to tell ourselves to be okay with that, Brené. Your words serve to make people a little more okay. Maybe not okay all the way, maybe still discomfited, because liberals like to feel, disturbed and upset. And by the way, I'm not a conservative. I'm criticizing you from the far, far, far left. Pro-Israel conservatives can go fuck themselves as well on this issue. There are some MAGA conservatives who are asking, why are we giving all this money to a foreign country? But we'll leave them aside for now. When we look away from the pain of any people, we diminish their humanity and our own. That's what this entire post does, Brené. You don't know it. You maybe don't care to know it, but it's the truth. And I hope you will spend some time learning about the amazing change makers. I will not learn about change makers. It's such a terrible term, just like influencers. I wish people wouldn't call me an influencer. Change makers, it's another one of these corporate terms that always indicates that whoever they're about to be talking about is relatively safe to the system. It's amazing change makers within, there was that Czech novel, The Good Soldier Strike, that my dad used to tell me about. And there was a political party called the Party of Moderate Social Change within the bounds of the law, or incremental change within the bounds of the law, And that's what you're talking about here. You're inspired by people who are tinkering and making little bits of changes that feel good, not people who are radically transforming things, challenging power, subverting hierarchies, and fighting against injustice. Those people aren't change makers. Those people are the resistance, the actual resistance. And they're the ones who deserve our respect, our allegiance, or at least our decency to shut the fuck up and not condemn them until we understand their material conditions. And despite my reflex to protect my heart from the sorrow in these stories, well, that reflex is running the show right now. And I wish you'd see it. And these activists have made you a better, more loving person. That's great. A more committed activist. I'm not seeing too much activism in this. I'm seeing some passivism, not even pacifism, but some passivism. That's a good one. I'm going to coin that, trademark it. I've got to remember to write that one down. And I'll continue to open my heart to their pain and support solutions born of their experiences. So you're going to open your heart to the pain of people who don't discomfort you too much, who in fact flatter your self-image as a good liberal subject of this hurting world. and an influencer who's only trying to offer healing. So I've been kind of brutal. I hope I've been fair. I'm speaking with the respect that I try to treat everyone with, which is the respect that you can be spoken to like a grown-up, and take your medicine. When you choose to speak up like this, I wish you'd remain silent, because you're doing more harm than good with this. You're telling people who are already being silent and equivocal about this highly unequivocal situation that it's okay to feel that way because it's complicated and all human beings have the light of God in them. And we're not having it. People are seeing through you. And I'm sure that feels difficult for you. I'm sure it's disappointing. You're a very easy celebrity and influencer to like. So it takes a lot, I think, for people to wake up to you falling short of your own ideals. But that's exactly what you're doing. And if you get called out for it, and if you feel attacked for it, and if people even say mean things to you, you have my compassion, but you don't have my sympathy.